to have you all along. It's a delight to be here and to see so many here at the start of this day and to think not only about church. You notice the name of this summit. It's the Community and Church Summit. And that is because the church can only be all that God has intended it to be if we understand the communities in which God has placed us and planted us and engage with those communities, understand those communities and connect with them. And that's what I want to start off by talking about, is how can we get a snapshot of our communities and better understand and connect with them. I think Paul, the Apostle Paul, gives us a great model for this as he writes his prayer list to the church at Colossae and begins or ends this book with two prayers. And the first prayer on his list is this one here, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ for which I am in chains. That God may open a door for the message. But then he adds a second prayer to that, and pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. And so both God's sovereignty he's praying for, that God may, but understanding his responsibility, that I may. And those two prayers together, I think, give us a bit of a model as to our approach as well. And so that we may do the I may bit, by effectively communicating, taking advantage of the opportunities God has given, let's understand our communities, where we are at, and indeed where we are headed. So, sorry, let's just go back a little. And Jeff, could you just get that one up and running so that I can see the slides? So, we are just days away, 40 days away, not only from a new year, but this time from a new decade, the 2020s, which are fast approaching and which will be, of course, a transformative decade. Just as this decade that we're about to round out has transformed things, this decade ahead will be phenomenal. So what will life be like when we conclude this decade we're about to enter and end up in this year 2030? I want to go forward and give us a bit of a snapshot as to where we're headed. But before we go forward in time, let's go back in time. And I want to go back 80 years for a moment to 1939. I bring up 1939 because that was the year that Parramatta became a city. And you're in Parramatta. I in fact want to congratulate many of you because this is the furthest west you've ever been in your life. And I want to thank you. Welcome you to the West. It is a great place. It's not as you will get out of here and survive and be safe and all of that. It's great to have you in the West. And in fact, this is only the middle point of Sydney. It continues just as far as you've come from the harbour. West again. We're in the centre of Sydney geographically and demographically as well, of course. So it's a fitting place for us to think about the future of Sydney and this state and indeed this nation as well. So 1939, thanks Jeff, the year that Parramatta became a city. Now, back in the day, a city had to have, or an area had to have 20,000 people before it was deemed to be a city. And that happened for Parramatta 80 years ago. Now, 1939 doesn't seem that long ago, yet now Parramatta is edging towards 300,000 people, and that is just the city of Parramatta. And it, of course, sits in Western Sydney, which is more than 2.5 million people in population. In fact, if Western Sydney was a city in itself, it would be the third largest city. If we split Sydney into Eastern Sydney and Western Sydney, you'd have Melbourne number 1, you'd have Sydney number 2, and Western Sydney number 3 before we get to Brisbane and Perth. This is a massive city in itself, and just an interesting time frame in which it has gone from 20,000 to nearly 300,000. I was thinking back to 1939, 80 years ago. Not only have the demographics changed, but the technology has rapidly changed. Of course, back then there were no tablets and all these devices that we have. Actually, I was thinking about that. There were tablets, but they looked like this. I did find this one. These were the tablets in 1939, and can you see the ingredients there? Menthol, eucalyptus, and cocaine. Just randomly to get you through the day, a pretty crazy time we had. In 1939, when it came to a post, it required a red letterbox like that compared to the technology with which we use and connect these days. A phone in 1939 looked like that, and we think, wow, they were big and clunky, although I was comparing some of the phones that we see today, and they're also getting out of control. So I don't think we have advanced that much with the portability of these devices. I did see someone predicting if this growth in screen size continues, the iPhone 30 might look something like that. So clearly the technology is changing, not always for the better, but it is one of the key trends, one of 4 key trends I just want to touch on as we begin. Technology transformation really does define us today. We're living in a great screen age. We've got a generation of young people shaped in this era that we call screen ages, because these are the only times and technologies they have ever known. And how they connect and interact and spend their time has been phenomenal and has transformed in this decade. In fact, it's not new, the screens. I mean, even us Gen Xers had screens. Some of us will remember the times at school that looked a little like this, get very excited when we saw that at the front of the classroom at the start of a lesson. But the screens have changed to be ones we carry in our pocket and ones on which this generation of young people are spending more time than ever. And so we have a kinesthetic generation used to touching and interacting the devices. We have a visual generation consuming content through that visual form compared to just the written or audible form of the past. In fact, the number one search engine we know globally is Google, but not with Generation Z. Australian teenagers have as their primary search engine YouTube. They spend longer searching within the YouTube platform, using it as a search engine, because they don't just want to read an article on something, they want to watch a video on it. That's how they consume their content. We've had a decade now of digital disruption and transformation, and we've seen organisations that have responded and adapted to the change thrive, and others that have, if you like, ignored those changes have been pushed to the margins. I mean, an example on the thriving side of this, just 11 years ago, there was a little company called Netflix that was still making much of their money through sending DVDs through the post. This was in 2008. That was still a key revenue source for them. Wind the clock forward 11 years, and this is what we have today, one of the largest entertainment companies on the planet and one of the largest content creators as well, and all of that in a little over a decade. That is the transformation, the disruption, and the screen change that we've seen. This is the research of Eric Sigman, who tracks time use studies. He's been doing this in the whole era of this digital realm, and in hours per day, you can see over these decades that rising screen time. But over the same period of time, the declining daily time spent on face-to-face interaction. And in every year of the lifetime of young people now in their 20s and below, they've only ever known the world of the screen time above the face-to-face time, digital skills, but those social skills and time spent honing those interaction skills not as well developed. And so we see the benefits of the technology, but we also see the downside of it. The cyberbullying, the inappropriate materials that are a few clicks away through the technology, the fake news and the fake friends, and the challenges that it presents. I saw a bit of a pushback, hashtag delete Facebook, that was doing the rounds about 6 months ago. Some people got off Facebook. Some of those old habits die hard, because then I started to see this sort of trend as people tried to live a post-digital world, post-Facebook world, and things like this emerge. Be the first of your friends to like this post. Some of those old habits died a little bit hard. Here's a statement that perhaps sums up some of the feelings that we have about technology and the downside of it. The internet is either the greatest blessing or the greatest curse of modern times. Sometimes one forgets which it is. That's actually an old statement, and I just changed one word in it. Originally, it was the printing press is either the greatest blessing or curse of modern times. And we probably aren't decrying the printing press, although we see the challenges of some of the stuff that gets printed. I think that if we can understand the technology and use it, if we can indeed redeem the technology, I think we can use it for great things, for redemption, for transformation, and for engaging with our society and connecting with an emerging generation. I have no doubt that if the Apostle Paul was here today, he would be using the technologies that we have at our fingertips these days. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 9, this is what he's saying. This is what he's communicating, is he not? To the Jew, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law. To the weak, I became the weak. To win the weak, I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means, I might save some. And if we can understand and observe these changes in our community and engage with those connection tools, I think we can have some great connection outcomes. But it's not just technology that's changing. Our demographics are changing. I touched on that just thinking about how Parramatta itself, where we sit at the moment, has changed. Here's how our population has grown over 2 centuries, and the angle seems to be kicking up and up there as that numerical growth increases. Here's Parramatta's growth just over the last few years and where it is predicted to go. And as I said, Western Sydney, 2.5 million now, edging towards the 3 million mark over the decade ahead. Massive growth across Sydney and in this particular area. In fact, if we look at the 10 fastest growing statistical areas in Australia, a few of them are right here in Sydney. So these are the 10 fastest growing areas nationally, suburbs if you like, SA2s as the ABS calls them. 5 of them are in Melbourne, the fastest growing city in Australia. 2 of them are in Brisbane, which is pretty fast growing as well. The other 3 out of the 10 are right here in Sydney. And we have the Riverstone, Marsden Park area, Rouse Hill, the northwest growth corridor, just on from here a little. We've got Cobbitty, Leppington, the southwest growth corridor, and these areas are rocketing ahead. In fact, let's have a look not just at it statistically, but visually. Let's take Rouse Hill there, you can see, as the example. So here is a photo of the same area in Rouse Hill in 2019 compared to 2009, a decade of change. And as we drag the 2019 photo across, you can see paddocks becoming suburbs. You can see our city growing and transforming before our very eyes. This is the growth of our city, and that growth is continuing. In fact, if we look at how we've changed in a century nationally, we've become far more urbanised. If we go back to the 1900s, compared to the 21st century today, we see that back then we had 1/3 of our population living in our capital cities. Today, it's 2/3. Back then we had the total population of Sydney and Melbourne being 1/4 of the population. Now it's 40%. How are we growing? Well, while we hear much about the ageing of the population, we're actually setting record births at the moment. The natural increase, numerically, is as strong as ever. The births are strong, and then the longevity gains are phenomenal, and so that natural increase is very strong, and yet the net overseas migration is greater again. In fact, if we look at how we're growing, that net overseas migration is the greatest proportion of our growth nationally. Which brings me to the third of these trends. Not just technology change and demographic growth, but cultural change. This is what defines our communities. In fact, if we compare the natural increase to the net migration, you can see where 2/3 of our growth is coming from. We've been culturally diverse for a long time in this nation, but that diversity continues to grow. In fact, we have 29% of Australians born overseas. If we bring that down to the linguistic diversity, 1 in 5 Australians speaks a language other than English at home. Bring it here to New South Wales, it's more than 1 in 4. Here we are in the city of Parramatta, and the data there shows 2 in 3 residents of Parramatta speak a language other than English at home. That's how diverse we are. In fact, let's think about where we sit at the moment, just as an example of how Sydney and our state is changing. This is the Greater Sydney Commission picture of Sydney, a city not of one city, but a city of 3 cities, these 30-minute cities, where people now can connect and engage more within their area rather than living here and all heading into the CBD. But, the city of Sydney, as we tend to refer to it, is actually now the eastern city. Here we are in the central city, and as I said, the Sydney Basin spreads all the way to the Blue Mountains, and that, to that point, becomes the western city. So in the centre, demographically and geographically of Sydney, Parramatta, how does that cultural diversity play out? What are those ancestral connections? That is best looked at by looking at surname, not just place of birth or language spoken, but surnames have a strong correlation to ethnicity. We worked with the White Pages and looked at the Parramatta phone book to look at the most common surnames. Now, normally, in an Australian phone book, you'd have Smith, Jones and Williams as those dominant surnames. Not anymore. Here's the Parramatta White Pages. No one uses the White Pages to look up phone numbers anymore, but really great for these sociological studies. And if we look at the number 1 surname in the Parramatta White Pages, it is Patel, an Indian surname there. Number 2 is Lee, the most common Chinese surname. Number 3 is Smith, an Anglo surname. We've got Kim with a Korean connection, and Singh, back to an Indian ancestry. Chen, Wang, Li and Zhang, Chinese ancestry, before we're back to Williams, an Anglo surname, at number 10. And so where the centre of population goes, the city goes. Where Parramatta goes, Sydney goes. Where Sydney goes, Australia goes. You get a sense of the changing diversity of this place. And the fourth of these changes, we've said technology change and demographic change and cultural change and generational change. We're seeing this in our churches and our communities. We've been a very harmonious nation across the generations till about a month ago when someone kicked off this OK Boomer thing and opened a new front in the intergenerational wars. But until that point, we were all very united and having a good time. It was actually kicked off, you may know, on TikTok, and someone uploaded a song with these lyrics sort of pointing out some of the foibles of the baby boomers. If you're not across TikTok, you're probably a baby boomer, so it doesn't so much matter. Maybe us Gen Xers aren't that much across TikTok as well, but it then was popularised. We had an MP in New Zealand, Chloe Schrabick, used the term in Parliament when she was heckled. OK Boomer, she said, and now the whole concept has led to a major franchise of clothing, and you can buy products as these things do. But, you know, the OK Boomer pushback of millennials or Gen Zs to an older generation is, I guess, just the latest pushback, and I guess from a younger generation perspective, they've had a little bit of negative stereotyping pushed their way as well. In fact, I was in Google, and you can tell what people are searching and thinking. Using Google as a great tool, you start to type something in and it pops up the most searched suggestions. So I typed in millennials are, just to see what people are searching and thinking around that generation, and these were the most searched suggestions. Millennials are lazy and ruined and entitled and snowflakes, and so the pejoratives continue, even being blamed for killing the diamond industry, as you can see there, apparently not getting engaged in enough numbers or something. This, though, is nothing new. George Orwell, many decades ago, said that every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. It's perhaps just the next instalment of that. But actually, we found in our research that the generation gaps today are less than they've ever been. You've got more intergenerational connections in the household and for later as those children stay at home ever longer. You've got great connection across the generations in the workplace. We asked Generation Z in Australia recently in a survey who most inspires you. And it wasn't just the social media influencers or the peer group through the social channels. My mum, number one. Friends, number two. My dad, number three. So dad's never quite measuring up to the mums by way of inspiration, but we're on the list, which is an encouragement and way ahead of some of those other areas. I think the church is the one place where if we can model and have those generations connecting, we can see that true unity. Every, not just tribe and tongue and language and people, but generation as well, being engaged and involved and having some impacts. So I want to conclude with three words for us by way of application to bring to some of these trends, to bring to our communities amidst this change. Three words starting with E, and the first is we have to engage with our communities amidst these changes, with these emerging divisions, and in these times or trends of change. A great example of engagement comes to us from the mid-1800s. I want to briefly tell you about Jon Snow. Now, there might be some Game of Thrones fans. I'm not talking about that Jon Snow. I'm talking about Dr. Jon Snow on the left there, who was a medical doctor in London during the peak of the 19th century cholera outbreaks. Now, he had a feeling as a doctor that the mainstream theory, this miasma theory, that cholera was spread through foul air, he didn't think that was right. He had a feeling that it was spread, the germ theory, it was spread through water as we know. The problem was, though, back then, whenever there was a cholera outbreak, to clear the air, they would hose down the streets, making the problem worse as that foul water got into cracked drinking pumps and pipes, etc. So he got a map of London and wanted to track in this terrible outbreak of 1854 where the deaths were coming from. The problem was, and he's credited with this map, and it's regarded as the world's first infographic because he was able to go around and find where the deaths occurred, find the center of the deaths, and then identify what was going on, prove his theory that it wasn't just foul air. Why were people dying in this area but not more broadly around the city? But he lived a long way from there and was not able to get into the community and really understand what was happening. But at the same time, there was a minister, Reverend Henry Whitehead, who was the rector of St. Luke's Church, which, as you can see, was right in the epicenter of that cholera outbreak. And Reverend Henry Whitehead had interests in medicine and epidemiology as well. And he was the one who approached Dr. John Snow and said, I can take you around where there have been these deaths, let's work it out. And so they went around the streets, tracking the deaths and creating this visual, which changed the history of cholera. In fact, they found in the center of it, and in fact in the center of the center, they found this pump. And here is what Dr. Snow says. On proceeding to the spot, we found that nearly all the deaths had taken place within a short distance of the Broad Street pump. There are only 10 deaths in houses situated decidedly nearer another street pump. And in 5 of those cases, the families of the deceased informed me that their family members had sent for water from the Broad Street pump. In another 3 cases, there were the deaths of children who went to school near the Broad Street pump. So the result of this inquiry made it clear as to the source of the problem. I had an interview with the Board of Governors of St James Parish on the evening of the 7th of September 1854 and represented the above circumstances to them. In consequence of what we showed them, the handle of the pump was removed on the following day. It's estimated that that action and the good reverend and the good doctor together saved in that epidemic alone at least 500 lives and countless thousands since then. The pump still stands on Broad Street with the handle removed. I was there in July and got to take that photo. No one else was taking photos of some random street pump, but I was impressed by it, and what a great story behind it. I see they have named a pub after John Snow. Not sure why the good reverend didn't get the same recognition, but it was only through that rector understanding his community and bringing another professional along with him that they could transform history. In fact, prior to the 1854 outbreak, the posters when cholera was occurring said things like this: avoid raw vegetables and unripe fruit, above all ardent spirits, do not sleep or sit in a draught of air. And from concluding their outcome and that infographic, that map and that analysis, the posters then said cholera and water, not to drink any water which has not previously been boiled. I guess the point of this, if we can engage with our communities, that we can transform our communities. Great pastors have not only a vision for their church, but a vision for their community. And the second E is not just engage with our communities, but equip our communities and equip the next generations to make a difference in their communities, to connect with their cohort and to bring the new skills and technologies they have to transform their cohort. Great pastors are focused not on the next program, but the next generation. We have to have an orientation towards that next generation, towards the future, towards those yet to come. In fact, this is the mandate of Psalm 78. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done, so that the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born. And they in turn will tell their children. Then they will put their trust in God. From generation to generation to generation. Let's engage and let's equip. And finally, let's entrust. Now, to give leadership opportunities, to allow that next generation to take on programs, to get others to step up, to release people, to delegate and empower. There's a risk. But without it, there's also a risk. Many young people leave jobs not because there's a compelling reason to leave, but because there is no compelling reason to stay. People, if they're not given opportunities, will move on. And I think we could change that statement and swap one word out. Many young people leave churches not because there's a compelling reason to leave, because there's no compelling reason to stay. So let's entrust them, let's empower them, and let's give them an opportunity. Now, it does come at a risk. I saw in the workplace, people are given responsibility without supervision. Some of the tiling doesn't get done in the way you wanted. Not sure what went wrong with the fellow that was asked to put up the sign at the front of the school, but didn't work out as well as they would have hoped. There's always going to be some foibles. There's chances for learning, but unless we entrust, unless we have a leadership model that empowers, I think we're not going to reach that next generation. Leadership styles have changed from this autocratic, hierarchical, top-down approach, I think, to a more collaborative approach. And it is this style that is flat in structure, empowering in approach, encouraging in tone, and enlarging in its outcomes that creates a culture of leadership. Now we've got the capital L leader, but lowercase l's emerging as well. Let me conclude with that great Afghan proverb that I think sums up the reality for all of us in leadership. If you're leading and no one's following, then you're just out for a walk. So let's lead, let's inspire, let's transform those that we have in our teams, and from there our communities, and make a difference for the Lord. That's what it's about. Thanks for listening.